Vern had it coming to him. I'd recently gone to Japan, and while I was away, Vern had made up some Hulk t-shirts. I'd been successful selling shirts on my own, and his shirts were just like mine. The only difference was that Vern was getting the money, not me. When I came back from Japan, I found out about it and said, "Hey brother, you sold all those shirts, where's my percentage?" Vern Gagne said, "You don't get a percentage. Those are my shirts. I've got a right to sell them." So even though he'd been copying my shirts and selling them, he wouldn't give me a penny. He just told me to screw off. That made my decision to go back east a little easier. I went up to Vern and told him, "I'm leaving, brother. I quit. I'm done." He said, "You can't do this to me." But I could, and I did. I got married on December 18th, 1983, and came back to New York, as a good guy this time, secure in the knowledge that I was going to wrestle for the championship at Madison Square Garden, as soon as I had had a couple of Allentown TV matches under my belt. At that time, the champion, Bob Backlund, had just lost his title to a guy called the Iron Sheik, so it looked like it would be me and the Iron Sheik wrestling in the Garden. I had wrestled there before, but I had really made a name for myself in the AWA. I was a heel back then. Now I was a good guy. Was I going to stay for the long haul or go back to Minnesota? Nobody knew. They knew the Iron Sheik, though. This guy wasn't just a performer, putting on a robe and a turban and calling himself a sheik. He was an accomplished amateur wrestler who had represented Iran in international competition. And before that, he was supposed to have been a bodyguard for the Shah of Iran. The whole match took 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Most fans had never seen anyone get out of the Sheik's signature hold, the camel clutch. But I did. And then I backed him into the turnbuckle. He tried another hold. I broke it. I threw him into the ropes. When he came off them, I gave him the boot to the face. He fell in the middle of the ring. I gave him a leg drop. The referee started counting, and Hulkamania took off like never before. After the match, the Sheik was a good sport. Even though he put me over and made me the world's champion that night, he came backstage and gave me a big hug. Then, in front of Vince McMahon Jr., he said that Vern Gagne, who I had just screwed over, had called the Iron Sheik the night before the match and offered him $100,000 to break my leg in the ring. But he had decided not to do it. He didn't want to hurt me. In the end, it turned out to be a good business decision for him. The Sheik was able to keep working as a wrestler and make a ton of money for the next couple of years wrestling me in return matches. Before I beat the Iron Sheik, the success of the company had always rested on 6 or 8 pairs of shoulders. But as soon as I won the match in Madison Square Garden and captured the imagination of the wrestling world, the load was placed squarely on the back of one guy, me, Hulk Hogan. Wrestling was red hot, so hot that we were running 2 sold-out venues a night. If we were in New York on Monday night, they would also book an event in Chicago. If we were in Boston, they would also book an event in Pittsburgh. We had A and B towns. The wrestlers used to check their booking sheets to see if they were on the same venue as Hulk Hogan, because they knew I would draw more people and they would make better money. I was running hard, brother. I started piling up frequent flyer miles. That first year after I beat the Sheik, I got on 300 different flights and wrestled close to 400 matches. It was crazy, out of control. And it wasn't just wrestling I had to worry about. I had all kinds of stuff on my plate, stuff that was just as important as what I did in the ring. If I was wrestling in St. Louis, I'd have to make a stop in Atlanta, Georgia to take a TV station manager to lunch, then stop again somewhere in Missouri at a children's hospital. Then I was supposed to show up at the arena and be ready to wrestle. Sometimes I would go to 3 or 4 different places before I finally got to the place where I was going to wrestle. Prisons, TV interviews, shopping centers, the whole 9 yards. It was just 24/7, brother, a non-stop roller coaster ride. I would try to cover all the bases, but it wasn't easy. The truth is, I was starting to transcend wrestling, and Vince McMahon Jr. looked at the character of Hulk Hogan and saw possibilities the rest of us didn't see. Vince started rolling with it. It wasn't just about a picture of your favorite wrestler on a t-shirt. It was about licensing, and then an animated TV show. I said, "Whoa, brother, are you out of your damn mind?" But he wasn't. Once he came up with the term sports entertainment, there was no limit to what he could do with it. So we kept at it. We kept pushing the envelope every way we could. Eventually, Vince decided the time was right for a really big event, something that was going to be the Super Bowl and World Series of Wrestling, and he was going to call it WrestleMania. The whole WrestleMania thing was just larger, crazier, and more intense than anything anybody could ever have imagined. And naturally, it was going to be held in Madison Square Garden, the mecca of American sporting events. I was on a card in a tag team match. My partner was going to be Mr. T, a stocky, trash-talking bouncer from Chicago who had won a Tough Man contest, parlayed it into a role in Rocky III, and then became a star on a TV show called The A-Team. Vince McMahon Jr. put the whole thing together. It was going to be me and Mr. T against Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper. So we were running around the country, promoting the hell out of WrestleMania. But at the same time, for about a month before the event, I was training with Mr. T and teaching him what he needed to know to survive in the ring. He had won the Tough Man contest back in Chicago, so we knew he could be physical if he had to be. But there's more to wrestling than physical ability. I stayed with him day and night, trying to give him a crash course in Wrestling 101. Mr. T was excited about it too. He had always wanted to wrestle, and this was his big chance. His opportunity to start at the top. But as we got closer to WrestleMania and the pace picked up, his attitude changed. He had got pissy about everything. He didn't like the hours. He didn't like the zigzagging all over the place. Finally, just a few days before WrestleMania, Mr. T gave us our first scare. Up to that point, I was with him every day, making appearances and working out with him. But that day, he was nowhere to be found. He just disappeared on me. It turned out that he was sitting in some park with some homeless dudes, just chewing the fat. Finally, we found him, brought him with us, and thought maybe everything would be all right. Then he pulled another disappearing act. But this time, he did it on the day of the event. We had been plugging WrestleMania for weeks. Madison Square Garden was sold out to the rafters. Everybody was looking forward to seeing Mr. T in the ring for the first time, and for some reason, Mr. T wasn't there. Finally, I got a call from the limo garage downstairs. The good news was that Mr. T had arrived. The bad news was that he was leaving again. I said, "What? Don't let him leave, brother." And I ran down to the limo garage as fast as I could. The problem was that Mr. T had come in with two big white limos. Instead of him showing up with just his two bodyguards, he had invited 20 other people to come in with him. Girls, guys, he had a whole entourage. And of course, Madison Square Garden security wasn't going to let all those people backstage. I got down to the limo garage just as Mr. T's limos were pulling out. T was cussing, saying, "Screw this, I'm leaving." But I got in front of his limo and I wouldn't let him leave, because once he left the building, I knew we'd never find him again. Mr. T was screaming at me, "Get out of the way, you fool! God damn it, get out of the way!" But I wouldn't move. I said, "You want to get out of here, brother? You're going to have to roll right over me." Finally, he got out of the car, but he was still bitching and complaining about his friends not getting into the garden. I told him, "Look, man, just give me 10 minutes to work on it." Somehow I got everybody in, but you could tell that Mr. T was still agitated, and it wasn't just about his entourage. He was scared of wrestling that night. He knew he was out of his element, and he had a million excuses why he shouldn't go into the ring. Even though we had trained and prepared for the last month, I don't think he had really ever intended to go through with it. Finally, we got to the dance, and when the red light came on, Mr. T was a pro, man. He pulled it off beautifully. He was sucking wind and he was in trouble for a while, but he eventually got through it and did a great job. At one point, he draped Piper over his shoulders and caught him in an airplane spin. Then, after I pinned Orndorff, the two bad guys began to go at each other. The crowd loved it. We used Mr. T a bunch of times, and then when I went down to World Championship Wrestling, or WCW years later, we used him there too. And I never had that kind of trouble with him again. But that one time, he could have single-handedly destroyed WrestleMania, and if he had, there might never have been another one. The hardest part of WrestleMania was the road that led to it, with all the millions of appearances Mr. T and I had to make. And the biggest bump in the road came a couple of days before we were supposed to step into the ring. Mr. T and I went to the Helmsley Palace in New York in separate limousines. We'd been running hard the last few weeks, and Mr. T's patience was frayed. But as soon as my wife and I walked into the room, the phone rang. It was Linda McMahon, Vince's wife. "Terry," she said, "I hate to tell you, but there's one more appearance you've got to make today. You've got to go down to a show called Hot Properties, a cable show hosted by a man named Richard Belzer. I don't know how it could have slipped off the itinerary from the publicity company, but there are 50 kids in wheelchairs down there, a whole busload of them, and they're waiting for you and Mr. T to show up. You've got to go, Terry. It's a live show, and there are all those kids." "Okay," I said, "I'll go." Then I had the pleasant task of calling my tag team partner. "Hey, brother, I'm sorry to do this to you, but there are 50 kids in wheelchairs waiting for us to appear on this show." "Well," Mr. T said, "I ain't going." I wasn't in the mood to argue with him. I said, "Okay, I'll go myself." So I pulled my cowboy boots back on my swollen feet and started to drag myself out the door. All of a sudden, the phone rang. It was Mr. T. "Okay," he said, "I'm going with you, but that's it." I told him, "All right, brother, whatever you say." And we went down to Richard Belzer's Hot Properties show. So I put on my game face and walked into the studio. And guess what we saw? Or rather, what we didn't see. Kids in wheelchairs. They weren't there. Now Mr. T was pissed off because he thought we had been conned. I was trying to calm him down in the green room when Richard Belzer walked in. Mr. T had this metal thing with a big spring, some kind of exercise bar he carried around and said it was a parking meter he ripped out of the ground. He was cranking on it like crazy in the green room because he was so mad. Richard Belzer said, "Hey T, how you doing?" Mr. T wouldn't talk to him. He just kept pumping his parking meter. So Belzer came over to me and said, "Hulk, we're going to bring you guys out there one at a time instead of together." I said, "You know, it probably would be better if we went out there together." But he said, "No, I want you guys one at a time. It'll be better for you." I said, "Okay, whatever you think, brother. You're the boss. We're just here to help you out." Then Richard Belzer asked, "Hey, they forgot to tell me. What about this wrestling thing? Is all that stuff fake? You know, choreographed?" At the time, the mentality in the wrestling business still dictated that you didn't tell anybody wrestling was fake. And if you did, Vince McMahon himself would slap your head off. So I said, "You know something, brother? Probably the best thing to do would be to ask me those questions when we're on camera." So Richard Belzer smiled at me and said, "I see the game you want to play." And I'm thinking, oh boy, this could be a problem. Anyway, Belzer got Mr. T out there first and started asking him questions. Mr. T wouldn't talk. All he kept doing was cranking his parking meter. So Richard Belzer said, "I pity the fool. I pity your mama. I pity your mama's fool," trying to get Mr. T to say something. T still wasn't talking, but I could just about see the steam coming out of his head. Great, I thought. I was so worried about what T would do next, the sweat was dripping off my hands. But just this once, I could see Mr. T's point. We hadn't come here to get abused. We had come here to promote WrestleMania. This guy Belzer was setting us up. He was taking cheap shots at us. All of a sudden, they called me out too. So Richard Belzer started in on me. He was just really trying to be funny. I see that now. If I knew show business then, like I know it now, I would have worked with him and made the show great. But at the time, I had my shorts in a wad. I was tired, and Vince had alerted me to watch out for guys who wanted to expose wrestling. "Oh," Belzer said to me, "so you think you're a tough guy? Go ahead, put me in a wrestling hold. Put me in the camel clutch, the Iron Sheik's hold." I said, brother. That's the Iron Sheik's hold. I don't know how to do that one. Besides, you don't want me to put you in a wrestling hold." Belzer said, "Oh, yes, I do." Then he turned to his studio audience and asked them, "Don't you want Hulk Hogan to put me in a wrestling hold?" Everyone in the audience clapped. Everyone except my wife, that is. She kept giving me the eye and mouthing the words, "Don't do it, Terry." I could read her lips. Don't do it. She knew I was pissed. She could tell by looking at me. I was about to tell Richard Belzer to forget it. Then the band started playing funeral music. "Oh, come on," Belzer said. "What are you, chicken?"